We are going to be talking about not response to intervention, but the first tier, which I personally think is most critical, and that is the core program. And I decided I could have renamed this, AKA, if you teach them, they will learn. Because I'm not talking about program today. I'm talking about good instruction. And the kind of instruction that every child is entitled to. So we're not doing triage when they get to 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade. Because we heard a lot about triage today. You know, when children are older and they're not reading. And yes, we can do remarkable things with older students who aren't reading. But it is so hard to get them to catch up. So what we do in those early, and it's hard not just because, I mean, we can teach children to read, but it's all the content that they've lost, all those years that they weren't reading, that becomes the real challenge. So what we're going to be talking about today is what's involved with good instruction regardless of the program that you are using. And I do like cartoons, as Suzanne knows. And this says, the cloud ate my homework. You know, instead of the dog ate my homework, the cloud ate my homework. Well, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We have new standards, and I like the new standards. But we've had standards, and then we've had new standards, and then we have new standards, and now we have newer standards. A change. Then we have new materials that go with the new standards. And then we have new assessments, and I'm not saying a negative thing about any one of those. But the point is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because what we do know is that we still have a lot of students who aren't learning to read, even with the new things that have come out. So what is Tier 1 instruction? Tier 1 is the core. It's the core whether it's developed by the school district. It's the core whether you're buying a program, whether it's Wonders, whether it's Open Court, whether, and I won't say another publisher because I'm not supposed to. It is provided to all the students. It may be provided to all the students in groups and in different structures. It may be initially whole group and then small groups. There are any number of ways that that can be provided. And I'm not going to make a judgment about that because I think that good instruction can provide students in many different little learning environments. It doesn't have to be an absolute one or the other. It's scaffolded learning. And we're going to talk about all of these. Scaffolded learning is not just scaffolding the instruction within the grade level, but it's also scaffolded instruction across the grade levels. And I think sometimes this is what we miss out on, that we do different things at different grade levels. And earlier, just a few minutes ago, Vicki was showing you how those standards develop across the grade levels. The 1st grade teacher needs to know what the kindergarten teacher did, and the 2nd grade teacher needs to know what the 1st grade teacher did. When I worked in schools, one of the things I insisted on for the principals is that they have their teachers observe not other teachers at their grade levels, but other teachers at the previous and at the next grade level. And they do it at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. So that 2nd grade teacher goes into your 1st grade classroom. I'm sorry, I didn't even realize. Your 1st grade classroom. And she sees exactly what your children are coming out with. She knows the expectations. Now, if you're buying a core program, hopefully, this is all it's developed for you. So that instruction flows across the grade level. It is scaffolded. The learning is going on, and it is building one year upon the next. If you're developing your own in your district, and loads of districts do, you really need to pay attention to that concept of cohesiveness and scaffolding of the actual curriculum. We know that the core can be, and I'm really underscoring this, can be, I should say should be, effective with approximately 80 to 90% of the children. Why am I saying that? Why? I'm not making this up. What do we know about the majority of children who are, the percent of children, let me say it this way, who are in second-tier and third-tier programs? What percent are we talking about? We're not talking about 30% of our children. If we are, we really are not doing our jobs. About 10% of children, 15%, need that second and third tier. The vast majority of our children, the research is amazingly consistent on this, really should be successful in that core program. If we are scaffolding that learning, if we are teaching it well to all the children, and providing that additional support in the small groups to help those children who need it. This is one of my favorite. I'm sorry, you'll just have to find the self-help books on your own. A lot of what goes on in school assumes that children are going to somehow or another, by osmosis, pick up learning how to read. I mean, heck, we pick up learning, I almost said something else, but heck, we pick up learning to speak without any help at all. So we should be able to do exactly the same thing for learning how to read. And you have certainly heard this from some people. The point is, learning how to read is dramatically different than learning how to speak. Learning how to speak is something that we know a lot about. In some ways, we don't know anything about it. Although the more brain research that comes out, certainly the more we know, is that we pick this up in a very developmental way, children across all cultures, that there's certain kinds of stimulation that goes on, but there is no one in any culture who says to their young child, the first phoneme in this word is. We do it, we process it, and young children pick up meaning automatically. When it comes to reading, however, it doesn't happen automatically. Reading is an invention because the alphabet is an invention. It's probably one of the most remarkable inventions we've ever had. About 10,000 years old, and we really haven't come up with a better system. So we have to teach children how to think about the language they use automatically in order to connect it up to those letters, those arbitrary little things that we have out there that represent the sounds, put together represent the words, and then the sentences that we say all the time. We need to provide some instruction. It just doesn't happen. The single greatest determinant of learning is not socioeconomic factors. And I think this is so important because it's so easy, and I hear it on the news all the time, which is very distressing. I do a lot of talking to the television. Or funding levels. Money doesn't necessarily do it either. It's instruction that is the most important factor in a child's life. If we have good teachers who motivate, if we have materials that are well organized, if we have engagement, if we have all of those things that we're talking about, we should be able to teach children how to read. A bone-deep instructional acknowledgement of this fact continues to elude us. The fact is, we are here now talking about instruction. Why? Because that has continued to elude us. Every person who has spoken today has talked about not just the materials, but the instruction that goes along with it. And what we're going to be talking about today, what are some of the things that we should be looking at in the classroom? What are some of the things that we can do to help our teachers become better at the instruction that they are providing in the classrooms? How do we ensure that success? Well, first of all, we need to do some teaching. And by teaching, I mean we are up, we are active, we are working with children, we are sharing information, we are having them give it back to us in their own words, we are constantly evaluating children, we are making adjustments, we're doing that scaffolding. That is what teaching is. If you are going to, we've heard academic language today. We've talked about it, several people. If you want children to use academic language, The teachers in the classroom need to use that academic language. We are the models for that. And if we are constantly dumbing down our language, if we're talking about make-believe stories instead of fiction, we're dumbing it down. We're not using that academic language. And let me tell you, young children love that language. I was in a second grade once, and we were working on writing. But it was after we did the reading, so it was okay. I have to clarify that. And we were working on writing, and one of the things that we were talking about is the concept of redundancy. And it's saying the same thing repeatedly. And it's not, but children, have you ever heard children go on with the famous sentence, and basically saying very much the same thing. So we talked about this, and it wasn't a mastery issue. It just came up, and we talked about it. About 3 weeks later, a little girl, we were doing something where people were reading their writing. We were being collaborative. I didn't know that at the time. A little girl raised her hand, and she said, I have to say something. By all means. He was being very redundant. He said the same thing over and over and over again. Children love that language. And children learn that language. And they use it in appropriate places if we ourselves provide them the models for doing it. When we're teaching comprehension, we need to teach all aspects of comprehension. We have new standards now, and I think what they're talking about in terms of understanding text is exactly where we need to be, whether it's fiction or whether it's informational text, we need to be there. But we also need to realize that there are skills that will allow our students to get to that point where they can deal with the complexities of text, where they can read it and look for author voice, where they can begin to see the subtleties and the innuendos that are going on in the text. But unless they can read the text, they're not going to be there. And reading to them, and I love the idea of reading aloud, and by the way, every grade level we should read aloud at. More complex text. I think 6th grade teachers should read aloud. I think the 5th grade teacher should read aloud. But students themselves also need to learn how to read the text. And we need to identify what those areas are where students need instruction, beginning at that foundational level, and the standards certainly include the foundational levels, right on up. So we are teaching our children how to give them the skills, the tools that they need to read any kind of text closely. And we need to provide that solid instruction. And I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit different. We talk about children learning content all the time. Our students need to learn this kind of content. And there's no way we can teach it all, so we need to really teach them how to get that content. But I also think that we as educators have a responsibility for learning the content of our skills, the content of our profession. The fact is, there is content that we need to learn in order to teach our children how to read. When we go into classrooms, we should be looking at what makes up good, solid, Tier 1 instruction. And it needs to be purposeful. Have we talked about purposeful today? And what is purposeful? We've heard it several times. How would you define purposeful now? Oh, it is late. It is late. I can see it in your eyes. Go, thank you.
What you're learning, why you're learning it, how you're going to demonstrate.
Can I kiss you?
No, please don't.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Absolutely. But we as the teachers need to know why we are teaching what we're teaching. I think it's interesting sometimes when we go into classrooms and you ask the teacher why they're teaching it, and what do you think they say? Because I have to. Because it's here. That's what's next. That's what's next. And in fact, we really do need to understand why we're doing what we're doing. We're going to talk about all of these. Instruction needs to be unambiguous. We've said this in different ways today. I mean, that's why I said I'm the summarizer. But I'd like to, at least if I'm here, I might as well be purposeful, and try to pull some of these things together. The fact is, students need to know why they're doing what they're doing, and one way of doing that is by being unambiguous. They know the intent of the instruction, whether it's on the board or it's not on the board, because one of the things I loved in many of the school districts that I worked in, teachers were required to put the purposes or the objectives on the boards. And you would walk into those classrooms, and they would be covered with all the objectives for that day, or all the standards for that day, or all the whatever they were calling them in that school district. There was no room for anything else on the board. Did they do anything with them? No, they were just there. And somehow or another, we do need to help our students appreciate why we are doing what we're doing, and that helps by being unambiguous. We need to scaffold learning. And again, we'll talk about that, but it needs to be done in a way that is meaningful. We are not going to be doing it forever with a particular skill. When it gets to a certain point and the student has acquired the ability to do that particular thing, we need to move on. We don't need to scaffold anymore, or anymore, or anymore. And yet we see that all the time. Interactive, I think we all absolutely agree that learning should be interactive. Interactive with the teacher and the students, but also among the students themselves. It needs to be sustained and coherent. We have an amazing capacity in education, when things don't work, to do what? To change them. It didn't work with the students. It's not effective materials. It's not. We need to start looking within. What am I doing in the classroom with these materials? And can I be doing something differently so it is sustained, so you have things going on for 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years that continue on and develop into good teaching practices that aren't necessarily dependent upon a program, but can be used with any program, and interestingly, with all content. Teaching needs to be generative. And that means that it needs to have application beyond that point in time. How many of you have been in classrooms where you have seen pretty good comprehension instruction going on? And it's great. And I'm not doing that. I am not going to do it to these people. She wouldn't let me kiss her. I'm not doing it to anyone else. And you go in, it looks great. And then you sit in, because things are really looking good. And you say, oh, good, I'm going to stay here. And then we go into social studies in 5th grade. And everything falls apart. It's like they're looking at text for the first time. And no one ever says, you know, what did we just do? We don't communicate to our students the generative quality of, oh, I've lost some things. The generative quality of what we are teaching. We need to be unrelenting in it, too. You know, we've talked about schedules. We've talked about how we can organize our time. Every minute in this class, in any class, is critical. We have our students for 5.5 hours a day, maybe for 180 days a year. And as far as I'm concerned, every minute of every day is critical, and we should be unrelenting in our teaching. It shouldn't be wasted time. And there's a lot of it, unfortunately, that does go on in the classrooms. Learning needs to be challenging. I am a firm believer, coming out of special education many decades ago, that every student can learn. I do believe that. You know, we were talking earlier today about expectations. And I'm thinking back to the whole Pygmalion effect in the 1960s, where, you know, teachers were told that students could learn and a comparable group, the teachers were told they couldn't learn, and which group do you think learned? The ones where the teachers were told the students they really had potential. So our expectations are critical, and if we don't challenge the students, who will? That is part of our job. And we need to be uncompromising in what we do. We need to stand up when we believe that something really is important in the classroom, like teaching reading for more than 90 minutes a day, and say we're going to do it. Instruction needs to be purposeful. And that, as I said, is more than just objectives. It's understanding the why we're doing what we're doing. You know, we do a tremendous amount of professional development. And yet sometimes I'll go into classes afterwards and I'll ask the teacher, well, why don't you laugh? Why are you doing it this way? Oh, I don't know, it says to do it this way. You know, I don't want teachers doing it because the guide says to do it this way. I want teachers doing it because they understand the intent behind what is written on those pages. And you know, we talk about children raising questions. I think it'd be good if we raise some questions about intent of what's on those pages as well. We need to have some basic knowledge about why we're doing what we're doing. You ask teachers little things. Now, we all talked about these today. What is a bound versus a free morpheme? You would be flabbergasted at the responses that you get. Everyone knows what a bound and a free morpheme is. Cats, C-A-T-S, how many morphemes in cats? 2. What are the 2 morphemes? Cat, and cat can stand alone. It's a free morpheme. What's the bound morpheme in cats? The plural S. If you have an S by itself, it means nothing. It's a bound. It has to be attached to another morpheme for it to have meaning, because morphemes are all about meanings. When do you use the spelling CK for K? After a short vowel in English. And I always qualify in English. But these are things, I mean, teachers will say, oh, English is so ridiculous. And they tell their students it, which is even more frustrating. Well, it doesn't make sense, you just learn it that way. Well, you know, if we understood more about, had knowledge of, and this is the kind of knowledge I think we as educators need to have about why we're doing what we're doing, we could better explain some things to children. How do you know if a word is of Greek origin? What are some of the clues? Well, one is if it has PH for the sound, that's a dead giveaway. If the CH is good going, is a K, as in Cronus, which we talked about earlier today, and that connects up directly with things like chronology, there is an incredible logic to what English is all about. And we don't think about it. We just sort of teach it. And I'm not saying that you teach children, oh, I'm having a field day with this. I'm not saying that you have to teach children all of this, but I think as educators, we need to understand it. And there are some very good reasons. What's the difference between an inflectional and a derivational suffix? Not you. All right, I know it's late. I'm not going to do that to you. But the fact, I could say talk at your tables and I'll call on someone, but I'm not. Just your being here is reward enough. But an inflectional suffix is going to change the tense, the number, or the possession. It doesn't change the meaning of the word, and it doesn't change the part of speech. A derivational suffix, like NES, or TION, or LY, changes the meaning, or un is a prefix, changes the meaning, and it also can change the part of speech. If you add ly to an adjective, you get what? An adverb. It changes the part of speech. We need to help our students understand why they're learning what they're learning and the power of that kind of learning, because that does make a difference. English is not arbitrary. It's quite predictable. Another good example. You have silent G in the end of the same syllable. If it's a single syllable word, it's going to be silent before an N. But the minute you go to a multisyllabic word using that root, what happens? The G is no longer silent. These aren't arbitrary things. And if you take a look, particularly as you get into the upper grades, and challenge students in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade to look at where words come from. Are they Greek? Are they Latin? Are they Germanic? Are they French? Because if it's French, you could have AI at the end of a word. In English, you don't. The point is, this helps our students understand our language, but we have to understand that first. And this is one of my favorites for a spelling issue. And teachers will say, well, how do you know whether it's an E or an I? Or, well, you just learn it. Well, if you have the word nation, and then you say national or nationality, you immediately know how to spell the schwa. It makes learning easier. If we can help our students, I'm not sure I'm supposed to say this word after today, make some of those connections. And they are important connections. So why is this kind of knowledge important to the purposes? Because reading and writing are language-based. The more we understand about our language, our oral language, and everyone has talked about oral language and the importance of those standards, the better we can explain and help our students, not just with reading, but with spelling as well. English is not illogical. And I don't think it's fair to say to students, this is a very confusing language. And that's such a cop-out as far as I'm concerned. Because the minute we say that, what are we saying about ourselves? We don't get it. And we need to get it. We need to understand why we're teaching what we're teaching. And it also supports more logical instruction. If you know that CK is preceded by a short vowel, you're not going to teach it when you get to, bless you, when you get to long vowels. You're going to teach it when? When it has maximum utility. And when does it have maximum utility? With a short vowel. So we want to think about that, and it supports that generative aspect of learning because of nation, national, nationality, nationalism. We could go on and on. But the more we know about language, the better we are at setting those purposes and teaching our students some basic skills. But that, just realize the instruction is not an end in of itself, because we want our students to be able to look at a word that has CK and be able to articulate why that CK is there. We want them to begin to take some ownership. We want to make decisions based upon data, and data doesn't have to be just test scores. Data is all of that information we were talking about in the English language. That's data that should drive some of our instructional decisions. And programs and students should not be the fall guys. We need to look, when something doesn't work, at what we are doing in the classroom and our understanding as well. Unambiguous instruction. Critical. Teachers need to be clear, and the instruction needs to be coherent. We need to plan. I don't know who it was. Vicki, was it you who said teachers walk in and start reading? I've seen it more than I care to admit. And they are reading every word in the guide to the students. I'm thinking, why are we doing this? What have I missed? You don't read every word. You internalize that, and you do the instruction. Students need to know what to expect, and they need to know the focus of what they are learning. Because I've seen too many lessons where I have no idea what the focus is. It's interesting. Principals, I'll be there with the principal, and that's the worst one, because they'll say, great lesson. Did you see how the kids were all with the teacher? And I'm thinking, I have no idea what the teacher was teaching. The fact is, it needs to be focused, and students need to know what that focus is, and it's not by having that list on the board of purposes. It needs to be explicitly stated, and it needs to be reflected in the actual instruction. Ambiguous instruction is like reading a paragraph with only pronouns. He said he would give it to her. She was most grateful and thanked him for it. 2 days later, they bought another one. I have no idea what it, he, one, any of that stands for. It's ambiguous. And there is instruction that goes on in the classroom that is also ambiguous. Today we're going to segment words. This is a very simple early phonemic awareness activity. Today we're going to segment words into individual sounds. If I say the word cat, I hear the sounds k, a, t. The word is cat, and it has 3 sounds. I'm happy. Stop. But the teacher then goes on. And now we're going to have a whole discussion about the teacher's cat. And then we're going to have a whole discussion about someone else's cats. And that may lead to a discussion about dogs, and it may lead to a discussion about pets, and who knows where. What is the purpose? What is the focus? What is the intent of this lesson? What is it? It's segmenting the word. And that gets lost because then we do thin. Oh, and then we have another whole discussion. And teachers will say to me, but you don't understand. They don't know the meaning of all of these words. Yes, I do understand. First of all, it is one of the hardest things to get across to teachers that phonemic awareness can be done regardless of meaning. All right, but if meaning is important, I'm willing to say, how can we do it in a way that doesn't destroy the intent, that allows for the integrity or the unambiguousness of the lesson? An option, and these are things that we can work out easily. Today we're going to segment words into individual sounds. If I say the word cat, we can segment the word into 3 sounds. K, a, t. Now let's try some. And we're going to do it with all of those. We're not going to stop. We're going to segment. But what am I doing at the end? After we've done the intent, the main purpose of the lesson, what am I doing at the end? Meaning. I'm not against meaning, but could we put it in the proper perspective so students understand that the focus of this lesson really is on breaking words into parts, into individual sounds, and then we can do some talking about meaning. And we just need to think through some of these things and come up with, we were talking about solutions earlier, and that little boy who found solutions. We need to do some more problem solving. Students must learn what the strategy is or what the skill is, why it's important, and how and when to apply it. We need to be clear to our students why we are doing what we're doing so they will know what they are learning, and then they can begin to see how to use that in new or novel situations. Routines. Coming from open court, I have been told more than I care to admit to that we are a very scripted program because we have routines. And yet routines are important in life. And you know, I felt somewhat vindicated today because I heard the word routine many times throughout the day. It's letting students know what's expected from them in different situations. You were talking about routines earlier today, and there can be those procedural routines, there can be instructional routines. It's okay to have routines. And it goes beyond classroom management because effective teachers use routines to make the most out of their time in the classroom. And time is of the essence. But you know, routines are also part of real life. Someone mentioned the scientific method earlier. That, I hate to tell you, is a routine. And there isn't a scientist out there who says, I can't be creative because I follow the scientific method. What is the scientific method? What is that research routine? Oh, come on. What is it? You teach it? All right, this talk at your tables. I'm not giving you this one. Come on, let's get one or two of these things out. I'm not the only one who's going to do the working. Good. Oh, yes. What do you... What does a scientist do? A scientist? Research. All right, so what is the routine, the structure? They look at the research. They say, what's out there? They don't reinvent. Thank you. All right, we seem to be getting a little bit more involved. All right, so what's one of the first things that, if any of you have written a thesis, you should absolutely know this. What's the first thing? What? Identify a problem and do some research to see what is out there. You're not going to researchers don't reinvent the world. They ask good questions that lead to more questions that lead hopefully to some of those answers. All right, so then they get that body of research done, and then what do? They develop a hypothesis. Now, if you are a biologist, you're going to do it in your area of expertise and in that narrow area that you're thinking about. But if you are a physicist, then you may be doing it, but it's a routine. And it isn't stifling anyone's creativity. As a matter of fact, because there's a structure, it's enhancing your creativity because you can look at the problem in light of what's been done, come up with more answers, evaluate what you found out, ask more questions, and do more research. Routines are part of life, and yet we make noises like, oh, that's going to stifle children's creativity if we have routines. It absolutely doesn't. Scaffolding instruction. This is one of my pets because I see scaffolding going on to the point that I'm thinking, there's nothing left to scaffold. You know, could we just drop it and let the student go on to the next issue, concern, problem, bit of learning, because otherwise the teacher is always in control. Contractors use scaffolding all the time, and I'd like you to think about this analogy. And they use it until when? Till the building is done. And then what happens to the scaffold? It goes away. And we as teachers, as educators, need to think about that as well. We need to provide that scaffolding to support new learning and then withdraw it as our students demonstrate the ability to use the skill, the strategy, to do a close read, to do any of the things that we're talking about today. But we need to work on that. Scaffolding should also lead to ownership of learning by the students, that they themselves should begin to take some ownership of learning. One of the ways that we can do this, and one of the scaffolds that we can use, is to actually have our students do some thinking aloud. Now, who usually does the thinking aloud? The teacher. It would be really nice to have students do some thinking aloud. Remember earlier you saw the students need to learn what the strategy is, how to use the strategy, have it modeled. But then you need to turn that responsibility for using it over to the students. Because otherwise, who's doing the thinking all day long in the classroom? Who's doing the thinking? If the teacher. Who needs to be? We're talking about these wonderful standards. Who's supposed to be doing the thinking? The students. And you know, I have to say, I was talking about teaching to the test. And I hear all the time, and I read all the time about, well, you know, we can't have these standards because we're going to be teaching to the tests, and then we're just going to have kids who just do the test and they can't do anything else. If you teach children, our students, how to look at text, how to access text, how to think about text, how to solve problems as they're reading text, how to figure out what isn't making sense and what to do about it, you're not teaching to them, you're teaching to the test, you're teaching them good learning skills that will last them throughout all kinds of situations, including taking a test. And this idea that teachers will take months to teach to the test clearly sends me over the edge. If we teach our children how to deal with text, the test isn't the issue. They will deal with it. So students need to begin to use these and then apply their knowledge of strategic reading, you will note, throughout the day. That means in the science class, the math class, the social studies class, the art class, any class. Reading is reading is reading. And you've seen this transfer of ownership kind of diagram, where in fact, students gradually take ownership of using and applying those strategies. And someone said, and maybe it was Juvicki, because the most recency effect clearly is impacting me, and at my age, that is important. But the fact is that you will be using this kind of technique throughout the year. The only thing is, what you're teaching changes. What you're teaching changes. We've talked about interactive instruction. I think we all know how important that is. The teachers need to be explaining. They need to be talking, but they also need to be giving students the opportunity to do some talking. Because I think if we went into classrooms now, after how many years of the concept of modeling strategies and turning it over to the students, who do you think is doing most of the talking? The teacher. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And we could even go back to Dolores Durkin and say, and how much real instruction is going on in some of those classrooms. I would like to see every student be able to articulate what they're learning and why. Why am I learning to use this strategy? Why am I learning to this second read? What am I getting out of it? How is this going to help me when I'm reading something else? What is the point of learning about the structures of different text? What's it going to do for me? Well, it'll help you not only in reading, but it'll certainly help in writing as well. We want students raising questions and discussing, and we want learning shared. I'm telling you, children at the kindergarten level learn that it's all about me. If you've ever walked into a kindergarten and children are there and they're writing their names and they're covering it up so no one is going to copy their name. They learn very early on, this is my knowledge. And I'm not sharing it with anyone, and no one else is going to copy my knowledge. And yet we are here as a group of professionals. Journal articles are written, and we share knowledge all the time. Why is it that we don't share that little piece of information with our students? That is a very professional thing to do. Sharing knowledge, like routines, is about real life. And yet we don't help our students appreciate that. Thinking aloud is, I think, the only reason I'm talking about this at all is because I think it's important. Because thinking aloud isn't just saying, I'm going to make a prediction. But it's letting students in on the why. Why am I stopping here? And it's not because it's the end of the page. I'm stopping because the author has given me enough information, enough clues. This isn't some wild guess. Have you ever watched sixth graders make a prediction? They look at the ceiling. No, look in the book. It's in the book. Look for the clues in the book. It's okay to look in. Was it you who said, see, I'm back to you, Vicki. The pile on the desk of books that weren't opened? How many times have you seen that? And when students have to summarize or make a prediction, they're looking all over the place, like it's going to fall from on high. Look in the book. That's what close reading is all about. Look in the book. Think Aloud should also deal, when you're doing Thinking Aloud, with real issues. Don't just teach strategies or even close reading strategies or tools. Make them purposeful. They need to connect. And earlier today, someone said, you know, you don't do a close reading for something you understand. Well, I would call my summer smut reading. You know, that I don't do close readings. What, I get a look on that one. You know, but the easy kind of reading that goes on, you just read it. You know, you don't care. You don't go back and say, oh, well, I wonder why the author made the character do this. Well, you know full well why. So, I mean, we need to help our students understand when and why to use. It's the end of the day for all of us. I love this. Now that you've read the story about Ellie the hippo, it's time for the questions. Okay, why is Ellie living in a cage at the zoo? Why can't she live in a big pond or even a river? Don't you think if she had more room to move around, she wouldn't be so chubby? Teacher looks at her and says, not your questions, Ruthie, the workbook's questions. And then Ruthie says, and why do they get to ask all the questions? Well, think about your students. Why do they get to ask none of the questions and the teacher gets to ask all? And when we are asking questions of our students, we need to go beyond just the content level questions. We really need to ask the kinds of how questions and why questions that get students talking. If you're asking yes or no questions, you get yes or no answers, and it ends, there's no discussion. You need to begin to ask questions that really generate some thoughts from our students. And you'll notice, what new questions do you have? And how can you find the answers to questions that may not be answered in the text, particularly if we're talking about informational text. There may be all kinds of questions that are raised that students want to find out more about. That's what the internet is for, clearly. And one of the things that I do think we need to start teaching our students is how do you look at information on the internet and decide what's valid and what isn't. All information on the internet is not equal. Engagement, we've talked about that. We need to think, discuss, explore. Students need to do the thinking instead of the teacher. Whether it's asking questions, whether it's using strategies, whether it's trying to resolve problems, we need to get our students much more engaged. Robust instruction, we need to develop broad understanding of concepts. One of the things that we need to do is to teach our students how to learn, not what to learn, because there's no way we can teach them everything they need to learn. But we need to teach them how to access information, how to ask those good questions, how to use resources, how to evaluate resources, and to appreciate that even when you use all of those resources, the fact is it may lead to more questions. And to use academic language as part of that. I don't think there is anything wrong with using terms like the scientific method or research strategies or whatever. Students like learning that language, and they will use it. And learning needs to be transferable. What's an example of non-robust? Today we're learning a story about people who aren't real. The author made them up. And we hear this. And it's especially true for our students who are at risk because they don't have that academic language. Versus today we're going to read a fictional story. The characters created by the author, so we call them fictitious. It's helping explain why that term is used. And then remember, if they are going to be doing writing, if they're taking tests, they need to know that language. It shouldn't come as any surprise. We need to have sustained and coherent instruction. Standards, strategies, materials, and assessment do need to be coordinated. And in fact, the standards should drive the instruction, not content-wise, but the tools for dealing with text, with dealing with how to resolve issues within text, and then the assessment should measure that. And I think we got some pretty good ideas today of that happening. Curricula should proceed logically, not just within a grade, but across the grades. I use the term triage at the beginning because I see second grade teachers or third grade teachers or fourth grade teachers getting students in, and they're beginning their fourth grade curriculum, and then they have these students who don't seem to have any of the tools to do that fourth grade curriculum. So they're constantly doing triage, and that's the kind of small group instruction that needs to be done, not because the students can't do it, it's because they never had it in the previous grade. So we really need to help that. It needs to become progressively more challenging and complex, and we talked about complexity today, but we need to teach our students how to deal with that complexity. Just presenting them with more complex text is not the solution. And coming from special education, I believe very, very, very fervently that what we do in the classroom in terms of intervention, small groups that we do with core instruction, should be consistent with what we are teaching in the classroom. Don't give them a whole new approach. Look at what you're doing, how you can do it more effectively, work with the students so there is consistency in instruction. Generative instruction, and we've talked about this, so I'll move quickly, that students need to learn to apply concepts, broader understanding and use of these strategies across grade levels, to ask questions and to solve problems. I love it, the power of the root. And this is generative and expansive, because once you know one thing, you know a lot. And we need to talk about that, but it's also at the knowledge level. That it's not just about learning the meaning of words, but how do you take the knowledge that you read in a text and do something with it? How do you connect it up with other areas of reading? How do you begin to ask questions? And you know, teachers need to be comfortable in saying, I don't have the answers. In open court, we used to have a unit in 5th grade that was on astronomy. Do not ask. How many teachers said, but I don't know anything about that? Well, learn with your class. Have them ask questions. Say you don't have the answers, but how can we find them out? How do we teach problem solving if we're not even willing to admit we have perfectly valid problems about knowledge that we're teaching and how to get better at it? And of course, to develop those metacognitive strategies that support intentional learning. This is what I want to do. This is why I want to do it. This is where I want to go. I'm a cat person. Never, ever think outside the box. For cat, that's fine. But for our students, that's exactly what we want them to do. We want them to think outside the box. So the challenge for us is to begin to shift from asking questions, which is testing, to modeling learning questions, which is teaching. To generate that public sharing of cognitive secrets by demonstrating and using them and having the students do the same. To develop those higher order thinking skills. To me, this is key, to create that environment in which children are free to raise their hands and say, I don't get it. Because that's when most of the learning really goes on. And then to give students the tools that will help them solve those problems. And I'll end with, sometimes I lie awake at night and I ask, where have I gone wrong? And then a voice says to me, this is going to take more than one night. And you know what? There are no silver bullets in education. It's going to take more than a year. It's going to take multiple years. It's going to take a group of us working together to change how we look at teaching, to make it more engaging, to build teacher knowledge, to be able to share with our students so they can really begin to achieve those standards that we are talking about. It will take more than one night.